actually about 5 or 6 days ago here in Los Angeles, and it's called Comrades Nikifor and Sina, and these are my grandparents, my Ukrainian grandparents, and they really influenced my practice. And so I wanted to just start with this piece and kind of talk a little bit about family narrative and personal narrative. So my grandfather, this is a picture of him when he was a teenager in the 1940s, and his family was able to get out of the Ukraine, and were in Montreal before coming to the United States as a young person, and living in the Pittsburgh area, which is the formerly industrial city in Western Pennsylvania, so the eastern seaboard of the US. And it's really the only example of a city that has gotten beyond deindustrialization. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. So I work a lot in museum archives. And so the mural that you see on the right was 9 feet tall and 108 inches long. So I'm sorry, I don't know meters and things the way that I should, but it was really, like the size of walls in a gallery space, and taking up an entire wall of a gallery space. And I created this work using photographs and magazines and cultural ephemera from my grandmother in particular, so family photos and Soviet fashion magazines and historic Ukrainian textiles. And then I did a lot of work in the archives of the Cold War Museum here in LA to create this work. And I think about the work as being archival photographic interventions. So some of it will include my photographs, some of it includes found photography, some of it includes work from museums. So for example, in the middle part of the painting or the print here, these are actually paintings, socialist realist paintings. So socialist realist paintings show laborers as being very heroic and really being the protagonist in a narrative, doing manual labor or working on farms or in factories. And so it's just kind of this homage to my grandparents and the mythology of them being, well, refugees to Canada and then immigrants to the United States, and being this much a presence in my life. My grandfather died just a couple of years ago. And so, just growing up in a multilingual family, a family with different religious backgrounds. And this sense that I am an artist researcher. And so I thought this would be a good way to talk about the piece. And thematically, my work really deals with working class laborers, people who work manual labor or work on farms, who, really are on the edges of, being present and visible in society, but whose labor is significant in order for society to function. And so it fits into this research discipline called working class studies. And it's a transdisciplinary field that deals with creativity and research and creativity, literature, urban history, social history. So I'm just going to check the chats and make sure nobody's having problems seeing, hearing me. I don't see anything, so let me know if there's an issue. So there we go. So the exhibition that is up at your University Art Museum is this ongoing project that I started just as I was finishing graduate school in 2011. And I went to graduate school at the University of California in Santa Barbara. And Santa Barbara is this city that's right on this boundary between Southern California and Central California. And Central California, one of the main industries is agriculture. And one of the main crops used to be flower production. And the flowers were grown for seed and also for cut flower bouquets. And so there, this idea of deindustrialization in the United States really focuses on places like the Rust Belt, where I grew up in the deindustrialized Midwest. So that would be cities like Pittsburgh, Youngstown, Cleveland, Gary, Detroit. But the idea of deindustrialization is when an industry leaves a place. And so the deindustrialization of flower work in, this part of Central California happened, well, in the 1990s, early 2000s. So I started researching the flower farms here in Central California. And then as I was graduating, I got a grant from the Department of Cultural Affairs and did a residency at university in Bogota. And then for the next few years, really worked quite a bit on Bogota. And so what we're seeing in this image is actually still documenting a performance piece I did at the Sunday Bogota market, where I worked as a flower laborer with a cart that I pushed along with the other people selling their wares, at the Sunday market. And so what I made were these individually crafted flowers made from scraps of materials and fabric and things that I collected, because I don't generally, throw things away, for economic reasons as well as environmental reasons, and kind of they sort of mesh together, if you will, in that way. And then I picked the thread of this up with No Lugar in Quito in 2017, and this video is actually included in the exhibition that I'll talk about at the end of today's presentation, and it's on view in your university art gallery. And Pancho Suarez and I, and Pancho is involved with No Lugar and is a cultural worker based in Quito. We drove to Cayambe and we interviewed these floriculture workers about working on the plantations in Cayambe, and then some of them leaving, for personal and financial reasons to spend more time with their family, and not really needing to work in the plantations to earn enough wages. They could do that working in these flower kiosks that they set up, and selling domestic flowers that are not sold in the international market, and they're not deemed as being as perfect or as beautiful as the flowers that are flown from Quito into Miami. They, might have some bumps and bruises on them, and they're sold for the domestic market, or they're sold to other countries in South America. And this is a still. It shows the 3 vignettes of the mural that's in your gallery, and this is the back wall. And so I, worked with imagery that is part of the archive I've created working in Colombia and Ecuador. And of course, you can see the volcano in the central vignette, the volcano in Cayambe. And these are imaginary places. So the buildings here are in Ecuador. They're not all in Quito, but I tried to match the built urban environment of Quito and the architectural styles of the historic district, for example, with this, Baroque architectural, colonial Baroque architectural style in the central vignette, and then the cathedral in the right, and then with images of, of flower farms, replacing the streets, and a laborer here. And so these pieces are imaginary, and the way that this mural was created was kind of mimicking, in my mind, what Pancho and I did in 2017, leaving the city, driving through the mountains to Cayambe. And we'll talk more about this when we do the gallery walkthrough. And one of the things that I really try to do with all of my work is I'm very interested in design and textiles and fashion as well. And fashion as how we dress, but also fashion of how we create our domestic environments and our built environments. And so we see that here with the patterns that are from Ecuadorian textiles. And I would take elements from these historic textiles and extrapolate them to create patterns on the landscapes or buildings. So landscape in the right vignette, on the building in the center, and then on the horizon line on the right. So we'll look at this in more detail in a few minutes. And part of what I do is I write about my work, and I have an article that's in press. So what that means is that it's gone out for peer review to the reviewers of this magazine called Latin American and Latinx Visual Culture, and it is published by the University of California Press. And it's about Flores Trueque and how I developed this project and integrating my interest in working class studies with labor studies in Ecuador and Colombia, and then some art historical analysis, which required that I kind of step back from my work and be a bit critical of it and think about it, from a distance, which of course was a little bit easier because I've been working on this project for a while. And so some of the earlier chapters in the work, I was able to do that much more easily than this current project. My project for next week is to make some edits that the reviewers gave to me and then send it to the editorial committee for publication. And I have to rewrite the conclusion a little bit now that this this phase of Flores is up at your university gallery, which I'm really super excited about. So I'm a social practice artist, and rather than going into tremendous detail about social practice art with all of my exhibitions, I thought I would focus a little bit on another project, again, coming out of personal narrative, called Garment Workers. And when my maternal family, my Ukrainian grandparents, came to the United States, my grandmother, my great-grandmother, my grandmother, and then when my mother was old enough, they all worked in sweatshops. And my mother was in this situation, fortunately, that she didn't work full-time in a sweatshop, that she was able to go to college. She got a scholarship and then worked her summers in a sweatshop. And so this is another project that kind of happened simultaneous coming out of grad school. I was invited to be an artist in residence at Pitzer College, which is one of the Claremont universities here in Southern California. And Pitzer focuses on issues of social justice. So I always try to situate, personal narrative perspective of labor and laborers. And I really try to create a conversation in my pieces where the laborers get to speak and their narratives reflect on what I am creating as the artist of the exhibition. And I try to be very careful about not editing and not cutting and just letting the people speak. Because I want the exhibitions to be multivocal. So this Garment Girl started looking at issues of labor and labor justice in Los Angeles. And right around this time, 2010, 11 is right after the anti-sweatshop laws were put on the books in LA. And so as happens, a few years later, I was invited to do an exhibition in Vietnam at Heritage Space, which is a contemporary art museum there. And I don't know that much about Vietnam. I learned about the Vietnam War as a high school and college student. It is not my cultural ethnic heritage. It's not my religious heritage. And I really wanted to be respectful of doing this exhibition in Vietnam, where I just didn't come in and put some paintings or photographs or video work up on the wall. I wanted to do something that resonated with the community and the mission of Heritage Space of facilitating cultural dialogue. So I went back to the Garment Girl project. And the reason that I felt that it worked is that, from the earlier investigation of labor issues in LA, I actually met Vietnamese refugees who worked in the sweatshops in Los Angeles. And so then with the exhibition in Vietnam, that was exhibited in 2018 and then shown back in California in Greater LA in 2019, I looked at this transnational narrative of women in particular working in the garment industry in LA and Hanoi. And so I'm a social practice artist, and what that means is that it's participatory, it involves people and communities in debate and collaboration and social organization. And you can see the remake workshop that took place in my exhibition in the image on this in this slide. So social practice art is often associated with activism, and it is to help communities reach goals. It raises awareness, encourages conversation, improves living conditions and health conditions. And of course, not all projects do all of these things or all at one time, but these are sort of just general guidelines. So this idea of creating a multivocal exhibition, I've talked a bit about here with, family stories, and it's that personal narrative of my mother's family in particular. Um, and then I grew up in this part of the United States where the industry left in the 70s and in the 80s. So as a child, what I grew up seeing were the remains of this industry. So I grew up in a place that has a long history of labor and labor activism, but then also, marginal employment and precarious, situations. So I do spend time reading and spend time in museums and looking at pop culture, but also looking at academic, research, and looking at government films and, just try to think about material culture and intellectual research in an expansive way. And so I, get permission to use the archival materials from many institutions. Then I collect materials, and I use historic imagery from pop cultural sources because of, usages and rights to use the images. They go out of copyright, and I integrate these with my own photography and with design elements like I was talking about. And so what happens in this work is that you see issues of laborers. So the image on the right here, this is a wage record book where the laborers who work in sweatshops, do piecemeal work, and they are paid per piece. So it's called the progressive bundle system. And however many arms on shirts that you attach to the collars is how much work you get paid per day. And then this imaginary images, pastoral landscapes, it's what's called a third space. And the third space images in this work is really based on conversations I had with my mom that, she never really went to the beach or saw, she only saw it in movies. And so I wanted to kind of play on that and kind of pay homage to her story and my grandmother and great my grandmother's stories in this work. And so I, meeting workers and talking with them really caused me to consider the questions that I hope my work would ask, and, thinking about safe spaces for workers to talk, and hearing stories about, my mom getting infections in her eyes because the lint would get stuck under her eyes, when her job was to push one part of a garment from one sewist to the next sewist. So I started doing community engaged projects, and I don't think about them as art outreach, because art outreach is the institution or artists reaching out to the community. What I try to do is to involve the community in defining what the engagement project will be. And so what we're seeing here are stills from images on the top. Two women, the director and the attorney from Blue Dragon, and Blue Dragon specializes in particular in child labor and trafficking within Vietnam as well as beyond Vietnam. And so they deal with things ranging from, children working in sweatshop laborers to sex trade. They don't differentiate on the issue, but they really are focusing on the exploitation of children, particularly in rural Vietnam. And then the woman shown in the bottom on the left is a Vietnamese refugee who came in 1976 to Los Angeles. And when she came to LA, she wanted to work in the garment industry as a designer. And then her husband became ill, and she ended up working as a sweatshop laborer. And I interviewed her and her son, who is a video artist and writer based out of San Francisco now, teaches at California College of Art. And they talked about, the long hours that she worked, and that he helped her meet her quotas, her deadlines, so that she could get paid. And when you bring work home from the factory, it's called homework, and it takes the labor issues from being in a place that should be regulated, often isn't, but should be regulated, and brings it into the domestic setting. And then the other woman on the bottom register of images here worked in a sweatshop in Hanoi and then went out on her own and used social media to start designing her own clothes and using Facebook to sell her clothes. And she's actually showing one of her pieces here. And she and I collaborated on a community engagement project called Remake. Her name is Hong Pham, and she, you know, she and I set up the, oh, apologies, that top image is a little blurred, but you can see in the bottom image, we set up a workshop mimicking sweatshops in Vietnam here, you know, in my exhibition, and you can see the prints and the video here. And the engagement project was called Remake, and it was a craftivism project. So this is just a still, and we don't have a whole lot of time, so I'm not going to show you the interview clips, but gives you a sense of what the large scale prints look like. So there are 3 prints here, and they're vignettes of one piece suspended off the wall here. And the text on this piece is actually from unionization of the sweatshop laborers in early 20th century. And I wanted to use, while not my grandparents, my grandmother, great grandmother's periods, and most certainly not my mother's periods of working in sweatshops, it at least fit into the legacy of women working in sweatshops in the US. So it's, you know, make sure the label, it says union made, so that the workers, at least theoretically, were getting paid a living wage and had safe working environments. And just some other examples. This image on the right, the background, is what one of those wage labor books look like. And you can see the women signing it. Each of them has a number, and then it tracks how many pieces they were able to sew that day. And so then this is the craftivism workshop that Pham Hong and I organized, and we fashioned the factory. And like in Los Angeles, the factories in Hanoi are, when they are sweatshops and they're outside of the industrial zone, they are in houses, and very similar to Los Angeles. And craftivism is a form of activism. It tends to be anti-capitalist, so it means that we're working in small groups and we're recycling materials, and it's more of a cottage industry, if you will. It has environmentalism aspects to it. It's focusing on, you know, agency of women laborers, and it often centers on domestic crafts. So we use social media, and we used heritage-based social media to invite women in the textile industry to come and work with us. And we created new clothes from recycled ones, and we discussed working conditions in the factories. And the women who participated in this worked in the industrial zone in Hanoi. And I had actually been given permission by the Vietnamese Cultural Police. So I should say that this exhibition happened because the curator presented the exhibition to the Vietnamese Cultural Police, who okayed it happening. And then I wanted to complement the interviews that I did in LA with interviews with laborers in Hanoi. And it was originally okayed by the Vietnamese Cultural Police. It was okayed by management in the factories. The management then put restrictions on what I could talk with the laborers about. I could not talk with them about working conditions or their wages or, you know, anything about the day-to-day in the factory. But what I could talk with them about was domestic violence, because many of these women became the wage earners from these families. Many of them came from rural Vietnam and were not Vietnamese speaking. They spoke other languages or a, you know, different dialect of Vietnamese. So they struggled in that way to communicate with management. And there was an issue with the gender dynamics of being wage earners and being women and being mothers, taking care of children and taking care of their parents. And there's been an increase in domestic violence, in particular with women factory workers. And so management said I could talk with them about domestic violence and not their day-to-day work. And that domestic violence was an issue that management was concerned with because it affected the women's ability to show up for work. And eventually I was not allowed to actually interview the laborers, and I'm hoping at some point to be able to go back and be able to do that. And so this is just an example of how we use social media. And then the image on the right is Tu Kim Vu and the work that she made as part of the remake art outreach that was part of Garment Girl. And so then this exhibition was shown at California Lutheran University, which is in suburban LA. And we did a garment swap here where people at the museum and myself and my friends, and then we opened it up to the community, and we use social media, but we also use print media because there's a pretty big older community and retirement home population there, to bring in lightly used clothes that we could swap as opposed to, you know, taking them someplace. There are places like Salvation Army and Goodwill, but a lot of times what happens in these sorts of organizations is that the clothes are picked over, they're dispersed, they're can be put, and sent to lower income countries. They can be cut up into rags, and it creates a power dynamic and an environmental issue that I didn't feel really supported what I was trying to do with Garment Girl. So we did this swap. And then the clothing that was left over, we worked with James Storehouse, which is a service organization that helps foster children. Well, I shouldn't say children, foster teenagers who age out of the foster care system. So these are people who are teenagers, in particular with James Storehouse, who don't have parents. They live in a group home. Their federal money and state money for their care ends when they're 18. And then they are, have to figure out how to survive and how to make ends meet and to negotiate life as an adult, as a young person. So we worked with James Storehouse, and the clothes that were left from the swap all went to James Storehouse, and we did invite them to participate. And so I've talked a bit about this particular project with Hanoi Ad Hoc, which is a group of artists, academics, architects, urban planners based out of Paris and Hanoi, with people at, the person I spoke with early in the summer is a professor at Columbia University who deals with human rights. And then I've also spoken at RMIT University, which is an Australian university, and worked with United Nations, UNESCO, their arts and cultural organization in Vietnam. So this project that I'm also working on, so these are my three main projects: the floriculture, the Garment Girl, and then Untold Stories, which is really this investigation of the history of the place where I grew up and kind of situating how my family narrative doesn't really fit into this place. In the US, when you're an immigrant, you're generally situated in a community that has a history of people, from earlier generations who arrived there. So Northeast Ohio has a really, large Eastern European population, but in particular, people coming from the Ukraine, Ukrainian Orthodox and Ukrainian Jews. And I should say, my dad is great. My dad is super supportive, but my dad comes from a Latin family, is the youngest child. His parents died very young, so I didn't know them. So, it's not that I'm just getting to the point where I'm starting to investigate that history. I just kind of felt like I should mention that, because my mother's family was so much more present. Anyhow. So I grew up in Northeast Ohio here, so this area of Cleveland, Akron, Youngstown, and Warren. And then I'll talk about the project and how it's developing here, and how it's developing is through a Fulbright Artist Fellowship, looking at other disinvested communities in the north of England. And so the area where I grew up was, excuse me for 1 second. The area where I grew up was a steel producing community. And this industry left in the 1970s and early 1980s. And so I'm creating this transnational narrative with Liverpool and Sheffield and Newcastle. So steel, coal, and then Liverpool with its ports. And so I'm taking some of the imagery from the earlier exhibitions in the deindustrialized Midwest and integrating them with imagery from Liverpool. And it's kind of interesting, these, not just the stories of the communities, but the actual work that was produced, goods that were produced in these places. There's an unexpected direct relationship between what was happening in the industrial north of England and, say, for example, the steel produced in England and in the deindustrialized now Midwest was used to build the ships that left Liverpool. So, and one of the things I'm really trying to focus on this project is the story of women who worked there. So in this diptych, we see the images of women on the right. This is from the Second World War, where women who were Anglo could, work on the floor of the factories and make a lot of money because those jobs were vacated by men. And that the men were hired to work in these factories based on nativism, based on race, based on religion, and then the laborers would work together based on these descriptive characteristics. And the attempt, in hindsight, scholars and, hearing laborers talk about their grandparents or their parents, or in some instances, their own experiences, that by working together in your group, say, for example, there were a lot of Puerto Rican people who came in the 1950s to Youngstown, that they worked together because they were Spanish speaking. And, if you don't speak the language and you work with people who speak your language and you live in a community, historically, this company towns that were built for the laborers, then you're not, integrating, it's not an integrated work environment, it's not an integrated community, and it prevents unionization. So I wanted to start looking at what happened with women in heavy industry. And we see these women here, they were called the welderettes. And then we have an African-American woman here, and this picture is from the Opie Evans archives at the University of Akron. And Akron was Goodyear Tire, Goodrich, Firestone tires. It's a little bit later, but it tells what the story, or one of the stories that this piece tells, is that, well, Anglo women could start making more money working on the floor. They then vacated the support staff jobs, and that then let African-American women into the support staff jobs that they were not able to have, when men were working on the floor of the factories, and then Anglo women were working in support staff. So the history of industrialization here brings in issues of race and gender and social class as well. And I'm very interested in architecture and in interior design. And this image to the left here, well, both these kitchens were produced in Warren, Ohio, and they are called Youngstown Steel Kitchens. And Youngstown Steel Kitchens was a subsidiary of Mullins Manufacturing, and you can trace that back to US Steel, also made in Youngstown and Pittsburgh. So in mid-century America, this idea of modern design was actually being fabricated in these cities that, in 20 years, we're going to experience, really rapid disinvestment. And I want to take this historic imagery, as my Fulbright, because of the pandemic, was delayed, and so it's kind of reshaped my project. But one of the things I think is important is looking at the historic imagery of the connection between the past and how we can see that in the cities through the architecture, the history of neighborhoods, through what happens with modernization mid-20th century and neighborhoods being broken apart by beltways, so freeways, highways being built through them, and how women and people of color were treated, and how that legacy in contemporary contemporary stories that can be told about these places. So anyhow. So then this is Youngstown to Liverpool, and we see the port with Liverpool and the factories in the background. So these are places that take the cultural tropes of disinvested communities, and it creates an imaginary place with the idea of being able to tell a story about the history of these places, what was once there and what no longer there is there, or what is there, but it's decrepit and decaying and falling apart. And so then this shows the Untold Stories Akron. So each of these exhibitions is a case study of the city. So they really are social histories. And you can see the image here in the gallery, and then the archival material. Opie Evans, who was an African-American journalist, photographer, news presenter, and telling the story of focusing in large part on the African-American community of Akron and Cleveland, but also then later in his career, just the history of these communities. And so, a similar process of how I work here with, and this work is entirely found pop cultural materials and archival materials. There's none of my photography. The mills are not standing, or if they are standing, they are collapsing in on themselves. So I'm really working with historic ephemera and museum imagery here in these pieces. And so I'll just go through them because I know we're on a bit of a time schedule here. And so then this is a still from one of the documentaries that I ended up making part of these projects. And so this is from Untold Stories in Youngstown, and Justin Luis Arroyo is talking about his dad's experiences working in the steel mills, coming from Puerto Rico. And then the man on the right, James Sean Crum, who's a phenomenal painter, his dad worked in the steel mills in Youngstown, and he shares about how his dad is still receiving money from the government because of the poison, as he calls it. I don't know specifically what the illness is, but as a result of working in the mills and his dad losing his job in 1979 and not being able to find full-time gainful employment and working what we would call today gig labor to support his family because of how this part of the US, this industrial deindustrialization, post-prosperity communities suffered financially. And then this is Mervyn and Marvin Evans, the children of Opie Evans. I interviewed Marvin, this gentleman here, who shared stories about his dad, but also his experiences, being a young person in 1960s and 70s and dealing with discrimination then in the labor force, and being in the army and re-enlisting because he couldn't get a job. And I should say couldn't get a job. He and his brother graduated first and second in their high school graduating class in Akron. So, incredibly talented, smart, insightful, really great people, and I just really appreciated working with them. So I did a couple of art outreach projects with this, one working with women laborers, and I interviewed a fellow millennial who wasn't able to get a job after graduating during the Great Recession, and ended up getting a job working with a degree in the steel mills in Cleveland. And so she spoke, as well as with and read an excerpt from her book called Rust, Elsie Colette Goldbach, and it's a phenomenal book. It was voted one of the best books by National Public Radio. Just really great success with that book and sharing her experiences. And also generationally, as a millennial, with older, some Gen X, but really a lot of boomers who worked in the mills and had a different perspective. And of course, this was during the 2016 election, and how her point of view was really different from hers, but they were all steel mill workers. And a journalist and a women's studies scholar and women's studies labor scholar, I should say. And then in Akron, having this discussion about reimagining Northeast Ohio and working with Kimberly Irvin Lee, who works with the Akron Urban League, focusing on minority-owned businesses and other perspectives from conflict management from a university professor who also is dealing with the COVID, not COVID, well, COVID, I think now, but at the time, the opioid epidemic and how it was affecting community morale and individual morale and issues of labor and self-respect and the dignity of work, and a historian. And then the urban planner for the city of Akron, and looking at that history of labor, but also how the mills and plants created these company towns, and the company towns and the employment was based on race and class and gender and religious beliefs, as I mentioned earlier. So that legacy, and moving beyond that legacy in Northeast Ohio. And I wrote about this, in particular, the Youngstown part of the project in this book by published by Belt Publishing in Cleveland, which is really focusing on regional stories and has this pretty amazing list of publications about the deindustrialized Midwest, and from different perspectives of labor, but social history, gender. It's just the past 10 years or so have done a phenomenal amount of work of telling the story of the deindustrial Midwest and giving a platform for people who live and work there to tell the story, and not having it told to us, or a reframing of this part of the country. And so one of the things that I have to really focus on is having a gallery career, because my objective as an artist is to create platforms for social dialogue and to facilitate social change. But I, of course, have my own responsibilities of rent and some student loans to pay and all of that. So I'm doing this series called the Modern Series, looking at interior and architectural design that was designed and built in the deindustrial Midwest, but focusing on the furniture and the kitchens and the more fabulousness of American architectural and art history of mid-century, when these, now post-prosperity cities were thriving places. And sort of, you have to think about, well, the places like Youngstown, where they're making Youngstown steel kitchens, mid-century had the highest home ownership rate in the US. And when we had the housing crisis and the Great Recession now, 10 years ago, it was that part of the country was hit, the hardest. So anyhow, that's what these works look like. And little tongue-in-cheek here, a little bit imaginary, this imaginary of beach culture as it was portrayed in film and media. And here's how you can reach me. And I hope I didn't talk too long.
Thank you, Jennifer. Entonces ahora voy a pasar yo a compartir pantalla para mostrarles la exhibición que Jennifer hizo ahora en la Galería Q. So I will share screen to show the exhibition that you have on Q Gallery.
Okay.
Let me know if you are seeing the screen.
Oh, we can see it now.
Entonces voy entrando, ¿no?
Yeah, we're going in. So I wanted to take advantage of the opportunity, to work a larger scale, just given the format of the exhibition.
Sorry, something's happened with my technical problems. Se me trabó el mouse.
La basura de la misma rosa.
Okay, I will charge again the site, the website, and
Should I talk a little? Maybe I should talk a little bit because I know we're on a tight schedule.
Sorry, what?
I know we're on a tight schedule. Should I talk a little bit about it while you're?
Yeah.
Okay. So, when Byron and I were emailing about doing this project, I wanted to, really see this as a great opportunity and take advantage of, the situation of working virtually. And so I was able to really work large scale here in a way that, the budget would not be feasible to actually print this work and hang it on the wall, because the piece is actually 80 feet long. And so you walk in and you see that back image, the image that I shared earlier during my talk. And it was to mimic this idea of an urban environment. And of course, it's all imaginary. And some of it is from my experience of, being in Ecuador and how I remember it. And again, driving with Pancho out to Cayambe. And then I wanted to show this sense of what labor communities look like and floricultural laborers, and not do it in a one-to-one situation where it's a relationship of reality, but more realism, my interpretation of reality, have the images be allegorical and fictive in that way, and allegorical to have us start thinking about this relationship between epicenter urban communities and anchor communities, and then these smaller communities where labor is being done, and the relationship between these two places, as well as the conditions in which people work. And that's why I felt it was really important to have the laborers. We don't see anyone's face, and I specifically worked with historic images here where we don't see anyone's face, because it then, I think, allows us, when we're standing in front of the work, to metaphorically occupy that space as a laborer. So the laborer is not confronting us. We then can imagine ourselves, as I said, metaphorically being in that situation, partaking in that narrative. So I wanted to, show some of these farming environments, the farm fields, mimic, leaving urban, going into the agrarian, but we see like the image with the mailboxes there, and that is American, that is an image from Southern California, but I felt like it was okay to use. It's one of the elements I used from the exhibition project in 2017, that it shows the presence of a rural labor community without actually showing the laborers. And this idea that, and I think this has hopefully changed some with COVID, that, laborers need to be seen, they need to be respected, they need to be paid living wages, they need to, have safe work environments. And so then that discussion happens from these 2017 interviews with the workers in Cayambe, which are directly across from, this imaginary allegorical piece that I created very large scale, so that hopefully when you go in and you see it, that it envelops you, that it draws you into its compositions and the imaginative story that it portrays.